right, good morning. My favorite time is preaching because I can take my mask off. We're glad you're here. We're continuing to do our two-service format. Next week, we hope to offer, in the second service, I know for sure, some children's ministry in the younger ages. And we're working on the first service too. We'll have a letter out to the church prepping you for that for the next Sunday. But today we've got two services. Kids are still in with us. So let's not be troubled by any kids. There's only two, I guess, back there. So turn with me to Judges chapter 15. The first slide, if you could put it up, culture war leads to spiritual war. I'd like to read the chapter in its entirety today. As you're turning to Judges 15, I'll just say that I've always taught that the gospel does not eradicate culture. It conforms it to Christ. When Christ returns, every kingdom, every nation, every culture will bow, and he will be Lord. And today, the church lives in many types of cultures, and we're called to be salt and light and draw those cultures and those kingdoms and those nations to the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is our mission. In Judges, we're getting a picture of what it looks like when God's people live in a culture that overtakes them, where they become to look more like a godless, secular culture than the people God has called them to be. And it's going to lead to war. Now, I want to read chapter 15 and see what we can draw out of this for us today. It says in chapter 15 that after some days at the time of wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife with a young goat. And he said, "I will go into my wife in the chamber." But her father would not allow him to go in. And her father said, "I really thought that you utterly hated her, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please take her instead." And Samson said to them, "This time I shall be innocent in regard to the Philistines when I do to them harm." So Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took torches. And he turned them tail to tail and put a torch between each pair of tails. And when he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines and set fire to the stacked grain and the standing grain, as well as the olive orchards. Then the Philistines said, "Who has done this?" And they said, "Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion." And the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. And Samson said to them, "If this is what you do, I swear I will be avenged on you, and after that I will quit." And he struck them hip and thigh with a great blow. And he went down and stayed in the cleft of the rock of Etam. Then the Philistines came up and encamped in Judah and made a raid on Lehi. And the men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" They said, "We have come up to bind Samson, to do to him as he did to us." Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us?" And he said to them, "As they did to me, so have I done to them." And they said to him, "We have come down to bind you, that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines." And Samson said to them, "Swear to me that you will not attack me yourselves." They said to him, "No, we will only bind you and give you into their hands. We will surely not kill you." So they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting to meet him. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and the ropes that were in his arms became as flax that has caught fire, and his bonds melted off his hands. And he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, and he put out his hand and took it, and with it he struck 1,000 men. And Samson said, "With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey have I struck down 1,000 men." As soon as he had finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone out of his hand, and that place was called Ramath Lehi. And he was very thirsty, and he called upon the Lord and said, You have granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant, and shall I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? And God split open the hollow place that is at Lehi, and water came out from it. And when he drank, his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore the name of it was called En Hakkore. It is at Lehi to this day, and he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. I just wanted to read the whole passage. We have shorter services. Sometimes I haven't been able to read all of them, but I want you to catch the whole story as I kind of break it apart and we talk about it. Because, put up my next slide. I want you to, I put this, this is a cartoon I pulled out of Google Images. This is a depiction of how World War I started. I want to make sure I get this date right. June 28, 1914, an 18-year-old fired a pistol and killed Franz Ferdinand, who was the leader of Austria. And what this shows is the interconnection of relationships. The first guy says, if you touch me. The second guy, if you make a move, I'll. And the next guy, if you hit that little feller, I'll. And the next guy, if you strike my friend, I'll. And then the guys in the background, if you hit him, ho there, if you chaps. And it's showing you these interconnected relationships. And what happened was a single incident where somebody fired a shot, killed a leader, started World War I. Which is similar to what we talked about last week. There's an incident that happened that starts this war with the Philistines. Now, in this particular case, you had these allies. And I read a book on World War I. I like history, and I was fascinated by how all of this unfolded, where in one country, if they just put the order to organize all their troops, this country watched and said, if they put that order, we've got to organize too so that they don't get ahead of us. And it just escalated. Dominoes falling, hitting one after the other, and it kept drawing nations into war. And this is what happens in this scenario. Dominoes fall. I'm going to talk a little bit about that right at the end. But the first incident was Samson saw a beautiful girl, said, she looks good to my eyes. And we talked last week about Samson, right? That Samson was acting more like the culture he lived in. The description of these days of the judges. Everyone does what's right in their own eyes. And Samson saw this woman. She looked good to his eyes. He said, I want her, even though she was a Philistine, and he's not supposed to marry someone outside of his people. And so last week what happened was, where we left off was he stormed off, killed 30 men because he lost a bet, took the clothes, paid his debt, and he leaves for his father's house. And look, today where we pick up, he's calmed down. He returns. And when he returns, he finds that, because he says, I'm going to go into the chamber. I'm coming for my wife, right? But the marriage is annulled. And the father's like, I surely thought you hated her, so I gave her to your companion. And he's angry about that, right? And so he takes, as you read in the passage, foxes, ties their tails together, and puts a torch and lights the torches, sets them loose. As they run around, they're set ablaze, all of the grain, the olive orchards, and it just begins to destroy the economy of the Philistines. And a battle happens, because after that, it says he struck, verse 8, them hip and high with a great blow. And that phrase, hip and high, describes that there were so many bodies laying there, you couldn't tell. The legs and the hips all kind of laying, interwoven, slain on the ground. And you see these dominoes continue to fall. That's leading to war. Now I put my next slide. I put Hebrews 2, 1-2, because I want us to point out the whole aspect of culture. The writer of Hebrews says, therefore we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. For since the message declared by angels proved to be reliable, and every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution. How shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? I love this verse. I highlighted the word drift and escape. The word drift there, when I was reading John Piper's commentary on this particular passage, he honed in on that word drift, because he says, Christians can say, I'm not engaging in the culture. I'm not, but he said, but a piece of wood, there's always a current. A piece of wood that gets tossed into a river, even though it does nothing, it's just sitting there in the presence of the water, will be carried away by the current of that river. And what is the current in which the church has been thrown into today? Because in Samson's day, the current had swept all of God's people. And Samson stood alone, except that Samson himself, as you see, trying to marry a Philistine woman, was being carried away as well. And the writer of Hebrews says, how will we escape, right? So, go ahead and move to the next point. I want to show you living in a hostile culture then. I want us to notice these things about the nation of Israel. And the parallels to me can be similar to the church today. We live in a culture that has a current, and we can be carried away by it like driftwood if we don't work against the current in some capacity. And so I want you to notice some things. I read the whole story, and there's three things. Living in a hostile culture. First thing is this, that it is possible to be so lost that the enemy ignores you. The Philistines in the story are the enemy. Then there's Samson, who's God's man, who God says, I'm going to give him to you to help deliver you from the enemy. And then there's God's people. Now, do you notice that I just gave you all the initial dominoes? It led to the hip and thigh fight where there's bodies laying out. And then it says Samson retreats and hides somewhere back in his home country. And so what do the Philistines do? They amass an army and they go after him. Here's the next domino. What happens is a raid. So now the Philistines have come into the land of Israel, of God's people. And of course they notice this. They're encamped. They don't want them there. And so their response is going to be to go and try to sort it out. But as they approach the Philistines, they say, what's going on? And they say, we're here, we're looking for Samson. We read this in the story. And then they go to Samson, right, to solve the problem. But don't you notice, it's like they're the enemy. And the enemy is not even messing with you. They're not even bothering with you. You are so lost that there's not even a fight between you and the Philistines. And I put down here that it's possible to get so lost that you're ignored by the enemy. The presence of a battle means that you're engaged, and there's no presence of a fight between the Israelites and the Philistines. There's no fight. Verse 10, just to make sure we don't miss it. And then the men of Judah, why have you come up against us? We have come to bind Samson, to do him as he did to us. That's it. There's no fight between them. They're lost in the culture. I put, secondly, that it's possible then to prefer slavery to freedom. I mean, in the scenario, Israel, they are the slaves. They've been overtaken by them. The Philistines have controlled certain parts of trade that have forced them to submit to the Philistines. They've intermarried with them and got the Israelites to adopt their culture, to adopt their gods and their practices of worship. And they prefer it because here there's a fight brewing. They don't want it. Just leave us alone. We've become comfortable with the way that our lives are. It's not the best, but we like the level of comfort that we have. Don't bring a fight upon us. That's the attitude that you see. Which means that they've compromised themselves to that culture. And because they've compromised, they totally miss the opportunity for real freedom. Because just think about it. It says in the next verse that Israel gathers 3,000 men and they go to Samson. So this is the picture. You have Samson, perhaps the mightiest warrior ever, a 3,000-man army, and a God. Don't you think those are pretty good cards? They could rise up right there and say, okay, Philistines, we're done with this. Let's fight. But instead, they're going to go to Samson. And the fact that they've compromised themselves to the culture in which they live, they totally missed the opportunity to make a difference, to bring about real freedom. And the thing is they actually look at Samson as a troublemaker. God's freedom fighter, Samson, you're a troublemaker. What is this you've done? That's their approach to him, right? Compromise means they can miss the opportunity. It also means they have no time for the people who are committed. When you're somebody who kind of lives in a compromised state, in a culture where you're just going to adapt to it, and then here comes the presence of God calling another person to stand up to things in that culture, and you go, oh, I don't got time for this. That's what you see in them right there. I can't make time for you, and you're messing with my schedule, and I'm kind of good with the way things are. One writer said, it is a sad fact of Christian experience that if you are a Christian committed to growing and maturing in Jesus Christ, you will often be hindered the most by other Christians who have become accustomed and accommodated to an anemic, wishy-washy spiritual life. So you see that it's possible to just be ignored by the enemy. It's possible that you prefer that state of slavery. And lastly, that the people themselves, God's people, they're doing the work of the enemy. They're doing the enemy's work for them. The Philistines don't even have to go track Samson down. They do it for them. They gather the 3,000 men, they go track Samson down, and they engage Samson, right? What a sad state for God's people. And I just wanted to make a point about this right here in this moment of the message, that there are no non-combatants in spiritual warfare. You're either darkness or light, as John writes in 1 John. You're a child of the light or the child of the darkness. There are no non-combatants. There are no Switzerlands, if I could use that example, right? And yet, that's what many of God's people would wish for, that I could just sit it out, sit the fight out, let someone else do the work. And when we do that, what we miss is the fact that there is a real spiritual battle behind everything. Whatever is going on in our culture today ultimately finds its roots in spiritual warfare. Paul writes in Ephesians 6:12, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. I have seen even some pastors and some of my friends begin to say there are dark forces at work, even today. Who are we then today as the people of God? Well, before we get to that, let's point out something about Samson, okay? So we're living in a hostile world, but let's talk about the faith of Samson. And I'm going to start you with this. Hebrews 11 says, and what more shall I say? Hebrews 11 is the hall of faith. For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, there's Samson, Jephthah. Those are all people we've studied here in the book of Judges, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, and put foreign armies to flight. Those are God's heroes, his freedom fighters. The hall of faith is filled with the people that God used throughout history to bring about his plans and purposes. And Samson is one of them. Despite last week, all the failings of Samson that we mentioned, the the aspects of his life that looked more like the culture that was against God's people. Let's go to the next slide. So we're seeing that he is a man of faith. And here's what I want us to notice, particularly in this chapter about him. First of all, that Samson was gentle with his brothers and sisters. Imagine you're the lone guy. Because remember, we made this comment about Samson, right? Of all the judges, he's the only one that had to do it all by himself. Every other judge, when they stood up, the people came behind them. Those other names that I read, Jephthah, Gideon, they had an army behind them, and then they went out and fought the battles. But Samson never did. Samson had to do it all by himself. And when this moment comes, his own people now, okay, you're not with me in battle, but now you're coming to tie my hands and take me to the enemy. Don't you think, as a brother, you'd be upset at your brothers when my brother turns me in? But he deals gently with them. Verse 12. It says, and they said to him, we have come down to bind you, that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines. And Samson said to them, swear to me that you will not attack me yourselves. And it goes on to say, yeah, we're not going to do that. We're just going to deliver you to them. So he kind of clarifies that. He doesn't want to get into this with God's people, within his own nation. God does not like disunity in this aspect. Even in his church today, the New Testament is peppered with verses that calls us to unity as a community of believers. He's gentle, okay? Number two, the faith of Samson. We can see not only was he gentle, but he had courage in the face of the enemy. I want you to notice this in verse 14. It says this about him. In verse 14, when he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting to meet him. Now just imagine the picture. 3,000 of your own countrymen came to capture you. They tied you up, it says, with new ropes, and you're marching along, and as you are coming into face with the enemy of the Philistine army, they begin shouting, triumph, we got our man. And he walks into that. And that's when, this is why he's in the hall of faith. This is the moment where his faith was, I'm not going to attack my own people. I'm going to let you take me because I have faith that the Spirit of the Lord will come upon me in the moment of need. And when he walked into the face of the enemy, they shouted with victory. The Bible says two things happen. Number one, the Spirit of the Lord does come upon him, but God does something else. You notice the ropes? I always had this picture that Samson's a strong guy, just went and broke these ropes. But actually, let's just make sure we get this right. It says that the ropes that were on his arms became as flax that has caught fire, and his bonds melted off his hands. The ropes melted off. Now, Samson wasn't going, God does something. The presence of God, the rope's gone. The Spirit of the Lord then comes upon him, right? It says, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey. Put in his hand, he took it, and with it he struck 1,000 men. This is the story, I think, for what he's most famous for. That and cutting his hair with Delilah. But he faces the army. Now, I don't have tons of time, but the thought is there's about at least 3,000 up to 5,000 Philistines in this army. He slays 1,000 of them, defeats them, and they retreat. And which leads to this. So we've got his gentleness, his courage, and his victory of faith. You know, a lot of God's people, when they have a victory, they want to wear it here. Look what I did. But Samson points his finger upward to God. In this scenario here where he's thirsty, in verse 18, he was very thirsty. He called upon the Lord and said, you have granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant. He gives God the credit. And what I want to show you is the end result of all of it is this, because we miss this in this one verse. All of the dominoes fall in such a way that now what happens is this, in verse 20, and he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. 20 years. He brings about deliverance in such a way that no longer are they going to be, we're just going to live with it. Because now, with this victory, the people are behind him, and he judges them, meaning he's going to serve in the same capacity that all the other judges did. How many times in Judges have we seen this verse where they judged the people, meaning they led them against their enemies all those years, bringing about the deliverance? Now, in Samson's case, it was told that he would begin to deliver. The final deliverance from the Philistines doesn't come later until the era of the kings. But we see all these dominoes lead into that, these chain of events. And we get to the end, and there were two things. Yes, two things I want to close with just because of time. I gotta land on the sovereignty of God. I want to tell you that I'm trying to give you a little bit each week leading up to, we're going to get to this chapter that's just horrible. And we're going to try to really make some strong analogies to today. But because of time's sake, I give you a little bit each week. But today what I want to end with is this. We cannot overlook the sovereignty of God. From verse 4 to verse 20, it is God who brings about this freedom. If you go back to chapter 14, his father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. What is he talking about? The lust of Samson's eyes, she looks hot to me, started all of this. But God had a purpose in it. He weaved all of these dominoes to fall in such a way that it instigated a war that brought about freedom and deliverance. That God is sovereign. God never falls off his throne. And he's able to work in what by human eyes often seem like horrible things that are going on, which is a way in which I can say always with courage and with great encouragement to you. Doesn't matter what I see in the news, God is still on his throne. And he has a way of weaving together things that in our eyes look terrible because he's got something on the other end. And lastly, that he uses imperfect faith. Samson is not perfect. We talked about that last week, which is another way to give encouragement and exhortation to you, because all of us have shortcomings. And yet God uses imperfect tools to bring about his plans. Samson's he ends up in the Hall of Faith, a great example of that. And yet he has some of the biggest falls in all of the Bible. But I land in with just taking you back to the beginning. You cannot be a Switzerland in today's culture. You cannot just drift, because the current of what's going on, even in today's world, will carry you away. You must look upon this story in a way to give you guidance for today. Be gentle with God's church. A lot of God's people are confused about where to stand in today's culture. Be gentle with God's church. Take courage when we have clarity on what the enemy is and need to stand up to it, and know that victory comes ultimately through faith in God, and we give him the glory. Heavenly Father, we thank you for another story out of Judges that can speak to us about today's culture. And I know that we're gearing up for more, maybe perhaps direct application for what we see today, and bridging what's going on in Judges to that, the truths of what we see. But just pray that as a church we would be like Samson, gentle with the sheep of your congregation, loving, and yet also have the courage to engage in conversations in a way that would try to clarify which way is this current going? Is this a good direction or not? And that we give you the glory in all things. So we just lift this up to you in Christ's name. Amen. Let's finish as we worship together. Let's stand.
Shame
This truth that sets me free. Jesus Christ who lives. You are stronger, you are stronger. Sin is broken, you have saved me. It is written, Christ is risen. Jesus, you are Lord of all. No beginning and no end. And you're my hope and my defense. You came to seek and save the lost. You paid it all upon the cross. And you are stronger, you are stronger. Sin is broken, you have saved me. It is written, Christ is risen. Jesus, you are Lord of So let your name be lifted higher, be lifted higher, be lifted higher. So let your name be lifted higher, be lifted higher, be lifted higher. So let your name be lifted higher, be lifted higher, be lifted higher. So let your name be lifted higher, be lifted higher, be lifted higher. You are stronger, you are stronger. Sin is broken, you have saved me. It is written, Christ is risen. Jesus, you are Lord of all. And you are stronger, you are stronger. Sin is broken, you have saved me. It is written, Christ is risen. Jesus, you are Lord of all. Check. There we go. I just want to say thank you for worshiping with us. Just a reminder, next week we're going to offer, for sure in the second service, we're working on nursery 2, 3, 4, and 5-year-old age range. That's what we're working on. In the first service, we're going to try to offer some of that. And still going to have the short services. I just want to put a bug in your ear. That does mean that if God leads you to help serve this church, you now could actually come and help in one of the services in an area and then attend the other service. So that possibility is there. But anyways, God bless you. Thank you for worshiping with us. We'll see you next week, if not before.